What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So I may or may not be playing some Magic in the near future, and I may or may not have gotten sent some cards that I may or may not be playing with. So I thought it would be fun to switch things up a little bit. Typically, we have the Magic player rate Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So in anticipation of this game of Magic that may or may not come to fruition, I thought it'd be fun to do the opposite and have the Yu-Gi-Oh player reacting to Magic cards on my channel for once. Typically, we do this on like CGB's channel, but I thought especially since like I'm going to be playing, I need to look at these cards anyway to have like a modicum of an idea of what the fuck I'd be doing. But I thought it'd be fun to like react to some of them and kind of just like discuss how our games are different, since you guys seem to like these videos. It's a bit of a last minute idea, and I thought, hey, you know what? I got to read these cards anyway, so why not? Let's just read some of them, you know, for all of you guys, since you guys seem to enjoy it so much. So let's go ahead and get into it. I pulled a few of them up here, and this is going to be interesting. Here's our first one. This card is Intuition. This card, I don't really want to say what these cards cost, because if we're going to translate these into like Yu-Gi-Oh verbiage, a lot of this would be basically like cost nothing for the most part. Like this is an instant, so this would basically be like a quick play spell, like in our mind, right? So this is Intuition. This card says, search your library for 3 cards and reveal them. Target opponent chooses one, put that card into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, then shuffle your deck. So this is instant speed, painful choice. That is 2 less cards than Painful Choice. For those of you who are watching this and are unaware, Painful Choice might objectively be like the strongest individual card in Yu-Gi-Oh! In a vacuum. It is this exact effect, except it is a normal spell, so you can't use it at, you know, quick play speed or anything like that. And instead of 3 cards, it's 5. And by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, Painful Choice is one of like the first cards that was ever banned and will probably never come off the fucking ban list, because that card is absolutely just fucking cracked. And if it were ever legal for any amount of time, it would just get immediately auto banned again. Like there's no way that card is coming back. So it's just like crazy to me that like something like this in this game is legal and fine, and there's like no issues with it, because it's, you know, the fact that Magic players have to pay for something, you know, to like, not only they have to pay for this card, but then they have to pay for like whatever the subsequent card is, either that's in the hand or in the graveyard. I'm sure there's plenty of cool combos with this card, don't get me wrong, but like the fact that they just basically have Painful Choice legal in the fucking game is like unthinkable to me. Like that's just nuts. Oh boy, let's see what we got next. Hermit Druid. Okay, so this is again, I don't even want to really read the costs here because I think it's kind of irrelevant, but for the most part, it's cheap, so you can probably do this pretty early on. This card says it costs a green and you would tap it, which means you cannot do this immediately. You'd have to wait for like a full turn cycle to do this. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land card. Put that card into your hand, and all other cards revealed this way into your graveyard. Hold up. So Yu-Gi-Oh has a couple cards that come to mind that are similar to this, not in monster form, but in spell form. So the cards that come to mind here are Reasoning and Monster Gate. They're basically this exact effect, except obviously we don't have lands in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? But the difference is you're looking for a monster specifically. So Reasoning is like your opponent calls a level, and then you mill cards until you hit a monster, and then if it's the declared level, it goes to the graveyard, but if it's not the declared level, you get to special summon it for free. And then Monster Gate is kind of the same thing, except you tribute a monster, your opponent doesn't interact with it at all, and then you keep milling until you hit a monster. That I think like there's a restriction that they have to be able to be like normal summoned or something like that. So there's like gimmicks you can do to like have cards get skipped over for Yu-Gi-Oh players. You know, we're talking about Infernoid, where they're monsters, but they get skipped over because they can't be normal summoned, so you can just like mill your whole deck. Yeah, those cards are both limited to a singular copy, and this card, I mean, again, like, I guess it's not banned compared to the last one, like Painful Choice. But what's crazy about this is that because it's a monster, you're able to do this like every single turn, and I imagine that it is not very difficult to build your deck in such a way that if you are playing this card, you can play a very minimal amount of basic land cards specifically, or you're playing cards that can like thin those cards out of your deck, that if you have this card, that you can try to go to the casino and just like mill 50, because if you're playing Commander, you're gonna have like a 100 card deck. That's fucking nuts. I don't know, again, like how any of these cards are legal, but I guess it's like, it's so weird because when they have costs, it's just comparatively there's so much more to consider with something like that, that it's like the dam isn't breaking immediately, right? But in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you're able to like just take your deck and just throw it into the graveyard, you're probably going to win the game, right? I mean, that's kind of how it's always been with Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's just wild to me to see stuff like this. And it's like, oh yeah, like this card's like fine at best. It's not even like the most crazy thing you could be doing in the game. Whereas again, by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, this would be nuts. I guess one thing to consider with this too is that unless you have a way to make this be able to use its effect quicker, because since everything in Magic has summoning sickness, unless it has like an ability otherwise, you have to play this, then wait an entire turn to use this ability. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, that would like never happen, right? You would never be able to like play something like this and expect it to live, because your opponent's going to see that and be like, oh, we're killing that, like 100%, right? So it's weird, because Reasoning and Monster Gate are spells. So you can do it immediately. And obviously, like, you still have the similar like deck building philosophy when it comes to playing a card like this versus those. But it's interesting because, like, you have to wait a whole turn, and maybe if you play this, like, directly on turn 2, since it only costs 2, maybe that is, like, the game is slow enough that this card will survive. I feel like later on in the game, this card actually gets a lot worse. But, like, from a Yu-Gi-Oh player perspective, this card's, like, also kind of bad anyway, because you're not expecting this to survive unless you have some insane way to protect it. So I feel like there are just, like, better cards that could do what this does, like, by Yu-Gi-Oh standards. I actually think that if Yu-Gi-Oh printed something similar to this, in the form, like almost like a direct one-to-one copy, I wonder if it would even be good, to be honest. Because, again, like, Reasoning and Monster Gate are limited, but they're spells. You don't have to wait a whole turn to do it. So I actually think by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, this card's, like, kind of mid. Which is, like, insane, because it seems so nuts on paper. But waiting a whole turn, I don't know. That's kind of rough. All right, next up, this is some cool art. We have Witness Protection. This is super cheap, so if anything, this is very close to a Yu-Gi-Oh card in that respect. This is an enchantment, so the closest analog to this is a continuous spell, I would assume. You enchant a creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green and white citizen creature with base power and toughness 1/1 named Legitimate Business Person. I gotta show this to Brittany. So this is really interesting because Yu-Gi-Oh has actually begun to explore this design space recently. I think there's a card, if I recall, and if I can find it, I'll try to throw it up on the stream here, because there's it's not out yet, but it's in Japanese. But basically, when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, the names of cards is very important, like the archetypes, right? Because there's the archetypes are sort of our equivalent of, like, the colors in Magic, because, like, that's sort of how people, like, build their decks. Otherwise, everyone would just play good stuff decks, which was sort of like the first few years of Yu-Gi-Oh, until we started seeing this delineation of, like, oh, okay, we're gonna sort of, like, streamline all of these types of cards in one deck. And, like, you can sort of, like, make them, like, you can put other cards in, but it might be, like, anti-synergistic with what your deck's trying to do, right? We saw this early on with decks like Gladiator Beast, Blackwing. Like, you can play those types of archetypes, like, and that's fine, but, like, you want to play the named cards in the deck, because that's going to have, like, the best synergy. And so that's been the case with Yu-Gi-Oh forever, right? I mean, you still even see that today with, you know, Snake Eyes, Ryziel, you know, Fiendsmith, Malice. Like you want to play the named cards in the deck. And so you might see the redundancy of, oh, I'm playing like Malice, like XYZ. I'm playing Ryziel XYZ, right? It's like they all have like that tag in the name, because a lot of the cards in our game will say, oh, add one Ryziel card from deck to hand, right? Or it'll say like, oh, if you have a Malice card, do this. And so that's just like an oversimplification of it. But for the most part, that's how like archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh work. And again, you can combine archetypes together, but they may not like meld very well. It kind of depends on like the way that the decks work. And so the point I'm trying to drive at here is that the names of the cards specifically are very important in Yu-Gi-Oh. This card that recently got announced has actually gotten a lot of hype around it, because it does something similar to this card, where it actually makes the monster on the field lose like its name. I think it like turns the name of the monster into like unknown or something like that, which is similar to this, where it's turning into a different name altogether. But I think an effect like that is actually a lot more powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh because of the fact that we have these like archetypical synergies, and there might be an instance where it's like, oh, if you control a, you know, whatever archetype monster, you can special summon this card from your hand, or you can like do X or Y or whatever it is, right? if I'm pretty sure, I need to look it up, but if that card is a quick effect, if your opponent like summons a thing and you use the thing that can make it unknown like reactively before they're able to keep playing, if they no longer control that named archetypical monster, now you actually like interact with them on this weird axis that we've never really had the ability to do so before. And so that's like what this card is reminding me of. And so I'm not sure like by Magic standards how important it is to like remove the name from a creature necessarily. Like that just might be for the flavor if anything else. I guess kaijus are kind of like this. So for people who don't know, kaijus are a series of monsters that you tribute an opponent's monster and give them the kaiju. And so that's sort of like what this does in a way, because you're turning the creature into like something else entirely, right? Like it's a different name. The kaijus are big. That's like a big difference though. This thing's only a 1/1. The lowest attack point kaiju, because you have to summon it in attack position, is 2200, which is Gamma Seal, and that's why everyone likes to play Gamma Seal, because it has the lowest attack, which means as long as you can get something big enough, you should be able to hit over the Gamma Seal most likely. But like in terms of like losing all abilities, the kaijuing over your opponent's thing sort of makes it lose all abilities. We like to refer to it as like making a monster squishy, where typically in Yu-Gi-Oh, you want to use kaijus against these types of monsters that might have a lot of like protection effects, where it says like they're like unaffected by everything, or unaffected by like a lot of like certain types of cards that are very common in a particular metagame or anything like that. And so by giving them a kaiju in place of that, not only do you basically like make it lose all of its effects, because now it's just like this kaiju. The kaiju itself has an effect, but it doesn't come up unless you're playing the kaiju deck specifically, which no one does. And being able to make it squishy means that now all of a sudden, maybe that creature before wasn't able to be targeted or destroyed or what have you, but the kaiju can be, right? And so now all of a sudden, all of your like removal options or things to interact with your opponent are online, but it's also making it so that they're not able to do anything with that creature while it's on the field, and they can't really react to you kaijuing over the creature. If it has like a graveyard effect, it would work, but for the most part, that's like further and fewer between, just because typically you're not trying to kaiju stuff that like would still have like some sort of effect. But this is really cool. I mean, like, we do have a lot of like analogs to this, but I like I think like the exploring the design space of the fact that we're going to have this like unknown mechanic. I'm really interested to see like how that's going to play out in practice, or if it's just kind of like all cope, because we're one of the few games where the names of the cards really matters, and we've never had this type of effect over the course of 25 years. So I'm curious if it's something they're going to do like more often, if it's something that actually plays really well, or if it's just like, you know, this is a new design space they're deciding to explore. Cool card, though. Cool card. What's next? Ashiok. I hope I pronounced that right. Dream Render. So this is a Planeswalker. I don't really know like how we can compare this in Yu-Gi-Oh, because, well, it's funny. This is sort of like... Can't believe I'm going to say this. I think this is actually sort of like a pendulum monster in a way, because it's like, it's a creature, but it's like not really a creature, but it's like, it has like these effects. So I can't believe I'm making this comparison, but you can't really play it as a monster though. So it's not exactly the same. So it's sort of like if a monster was a spell, but still like looked like a monster in the art. I don't know. That's a weird one. It's like a monster you can play in your spell and trap zone, I guess. So Crystal Beast, whatever, who cares? Basically, it's a thing you play. Let's go with that. Spells and abilities your opponents control cannot cause their controller to search their library. That is very oppressive. We have several cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That do this. We're thinking of Mistake. We're thinking of Thunder Dragon Colossus. Some of these effects are reciprocal. Some of them are one-sided. But for the most part, Thunder Dragon Colossus was actually banned for a short period of time. I think it's at 3 copies now, once again, because the Thunder Dragon deck has sort of fallen out of favor in terms of popularity. But that wouldn't stop people from trying to like throw a Colossus into their deck if they can. Yeah, those types of effects are incredibly oppressive, and so this seems pretty cheap to get out. Again, if we're like comparing this to Yu-Gi-Oh, you just be able to deploy it. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can summon 3 copies of Colossus on the very first turn, so you have basically 3 of this. So if your opponent outs 1, they still have to deal with 2 others, while not being able to search their deck, which in Yu-Gi-Oh, I think is actually way more impactful, because from my understanding from doing the videos with CGB and stuff, tutoring not only 1 costs you mana to do, but 2, it seems not nearly as common compared to just drawing cards generally. And so in Yu-Gi-Oh, we don't really have many cards that draw you cards, but we have a ton of cards that tutor for other cards. And so by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, I think this effect is way more punishing as a result of that. And so it's interesting that something like this for Magic might be fine just because of like the way the game fundamentally is. Where like Yu-Gi-Oh, again, Colossus is like okay now, but like back in the day, oh man, Colossus was rough, but a lot of people like that card. Anyway, there's another effect on this. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their deck into the graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. So you get to mill yourself, and then on top of it, banish your opponent's graveyard. That is busted as fuck. Imagine this in like tier element format, right? Imagine that there's a card that exists that you not only get to mill yourself, but then it like exiles their whole graveyard. I guess the closest comparison to that would be, I guess it's sort of like Mudora and Keldo, because they didn't banish the graveyard. They just shuffled stuff back into the deck at quick effect speed. But it is a singular card that does mill you and does interact with the graveyard in a way that can like punish the opponent. I couldn't imagine if like Mudora and Keldo said, oh, when you mill this, I mean, you already get to mill the 5. It says that. But then also banish your opponent's entire graveyard. That would be just fucking batshit insane. And like we already complained about stuff like Abyss Dweller and the like, which already locks the opponent's grave. But I can't believe there's just like, oh yeah, just banish the whole graveyard. Like, whatever, who cares? Is there, I think there's only like 1 or 2 cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I can think of off the top of my head that banishes the entire graveyard. I think Ruddy Rose Dragon banishes the whole graveyard, but like that's a level 10 synchro, and you have to jump through some hoops to get there. So like that's like way more work to go, arguably, to get into than just like slapping a thing down that you immediately just like ignition effect activate, banish a whole graveyard, right? Like there's like really old cards like Soul Release, but that only banishes 5. That's not even the whole graveyard. And then on top of it, you can do this every fucking turn. This -1 here means that this thing starts at 5. You can, over the course of 5 turns, just continue to exile their graveyard. Like in Yu-Gi-Oh, you wouldn't even have to get to that point. But like the fact that you can mill yourself theoretically 20 cards, then banish your opponent's graveyard 5 turns in a row, that's disgusting. That is absolutely disgusting. And on top of it, you're already locking them out from tutoring for shit in the first place. What the fuck? That is not okay. That is not. Not to mention, if you're playing Commander, you're exiling every opponent's graveyard. It's not even just one player. Like one-on-one, this is already insane enough. But the fact that it locks everyone and it exiles all of their graveyards on top of it, that is not okay. That's nuts. I don't know how we're going to top that. What's next? Sylvan Library. Again, I'm going to assume this is like free. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. This is already like ban worthy. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put the card on top of your library. So you're telling me, okay, let's think about this. 4 life is a 1/5 of 20. So a 1/5 of 8,000 is 1,600, right? 1632, 48, 64. Yeah. So you're telling me for half your life points, you get to Pot of Greed every single turn. I guess to be fair, oh no, you could still do it over the course of 2 turns too. What? I mean, Pot of Greed is banned for a reason, right? At least by Yu-Gi-Oh standards. But the fact that you could do this every turn at the cost of life, if Pot of Greed, okay, for context, for people who are watching this who are from Magic, if Pot of Greed said draw 2 cards, like pay half your life points, draw 2 cards, everyone would play it. 100%, there would be like no doubt everyone would play it. If Pot of Greed said like pay 6,000 life points, or like pay in Magic terms, what would that be? If Pot of Greed said pay 10 life or 15 life to draw 2, every Yu-Gi-Oh player would still play it, because just being able to draw 2 is fucking crazy. This is insane. I think, again, the biggest downside of this card, at least by like Yu-Gi-Oh standards, right? If you're going to try to like equate this to Yu-Gi-Oh, the biggest downside of this is that you have to wait a whole turn to use it. And each individual card in Yu-Gi-Oh has to be so fucking powerful that you can't afford sometimes to play a card that's only going to be busted on the next turn. And while like any Yu-Gi-Oh player would salivate at the fact that it's like, okay, I'm going to play this card that does nothing, and then next turn I get to draw 3 because you draw your card for turn and then the 2 off of this. On paper, that sounds fucking batshit nuts. But funny enough, this might sound crazy. That might be too slow for Yu-Gi-Oh. There are formats, like historically, if this card was printed like 10 years ago when the game was like a lot slower before we entered like the Yu-Gi-Oh 2 era or like modern Yu-Gi-Oh, whatever you want to call it. If this card was printed like 10, 15 years ago, every deck would play this card and it would probably be on the ban list. But now, it's interesting because like there's a lot to think about. One, your opponent most likely is going to destroy this. Like if you play this and like maybe do some other things past the turn, maybe you have a way to protect it, maybe you don't. If your opponent cannot kill you that turn, which in Yu-Gi-Oh is very likely most of the time, it's format to format, but for the most part, you can always basically die almost at any moment. So they either have to kill you, or they're going to like do everything they can to like deal with the board and remove this, because if your opponent was allowed to draw 3 on their next turn, then they're probably going to be in a winning position, because being able to draw 3 is kind of crazy. It's actually real, especially if the game goes longer, right? Because you can choose also to like not pay if you don't want to, or just take like the best card of the 3, or you can also choose to just take an extra card and only pay the 4 life. So that would be, again, 1,600 life points. You can even make it like 1,500 if you want to make it like a more square number for Yu-Gi-Oh. Wow. Like it's interesting because it's like, it's as crazy as this fucking sounds. I really think this is too slow for modern Yu-Gi-Oh. Again, this at the time of recording this, like it's format dependent. So there might be some formats where the game is slow enough that a card like this would be absolutely broken and would probably be banned. But like a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh is just really fast paced now, and there's so many ways, both like in main decks and extra decks, to like dispose of something like this if your opponent were to play it. It's a good lightning rod for removal. I guess that's like maybe a good thing, but wow, like it's so weird to me that the more I'm like thinking about this, that it may be too slow for Yu-Gi-Oh, because I'm just thinking about how each card is so necessary, and having a card that literally does nothing that turn, not to mention you have hand traps to slow your opponent down. So say you go second, your opponent's trying to do stuff, you throw a card or 2 away to slow them down. Now on your turn, you draw cards, so you're at like 3 or 4 cards for turn, depending on how many hand traps you deployed to slow them down. One of those 3 to 4 cards literally does nothing. It literally, like, you play it with the hope that over the course of the next couple turns, it's going to like pay you back, right? But I don't think that's enough. I honestly think that's way too slow for modern Yu-Gi-Oh, as crazy as that sounds. Really interesting card. This card seems like cracked, though. Like, I mean, by Magic standards, this thing seems broken. All right, what do we got next? Silver Shroud Costume. This is an artifact, so this is an equipment. Equip spells in Yu-Gi-Oh generally are pretty bad. There have been a couple instances that they're okay. I'm thinking like the old days. Like, I mean, there's obviously like equipment-based decks like Makonko and stuff, but I'm thinking back to the old days with like Megamorph, obviously, because I'm a boomer. Like, that was really good with like the Stein OTKs, like Demise, stuff like that. Butterfly Dagger is still banned for some reason, but that wasn't even for like because it was good. That's just because it's just like enables bullshit like loops and FDKs. But for the most part, like equip spells in Yu-Gi-Oh, unless they're like part of a specific archetype and that's like meant to be their gimmick, they don't really see a lot of play. So I'm curious to read this one. It has Flash, which means it's basically a quick effect artifact, which is interesting. Okay, if we had like quick play artifacts in Yu-Gi-Oh, then maybe, but I don't know. When Silver Shroud Costume enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. That creature gains Shroud until end of turn, which means it can't be the target of spells or abilities. Isn't that Forbidden Dress, essentially? Forbidden Dress is a quick play spell that almost has like this exact same effect. The difference is it's not an artifact, so like it doesn't stick around. It's like a one-time use sort of thing. But it has almost this exact text here. It says equipped creature can't be blocked. That's something we don't have blocking, so like that doesn't do that. And it has an equip cost, which you ignore because you just get to like immediately bypass that. So I guess like if the creature dies, that's like one thing that's different in Magic. Like if a creature dies, the artifact just like stays on the board. Where in Yu-Gi-Oh, the equip card is attached to the creature. So if the creature dies, the equip spell dies as well. So that's a big distinction, I suppose. But a creature gains Shroud until end of turn. So this is really interesting because Forbidden Dress is a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! And historically, that card sucks. And the reason that card sucks is because of the way that Yu-Gi-Oh works in terms of like the mechanics. And let me explain why. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, if I use an effect that targets an opposing monster, and my opponent as Chainlink 2 or on the stack for Magic players, they chain Forbidden Dress to basically have this line of text here that gives it Shroud, means it can't be the target of spells and abilities. In Yu-Gi-Oh, because the monster was already targeted, it doesn't matter that I used Forbidden Dress on that monster because the targeting already happened. So you would have had to preemptively use Forbidden Dress on a creature, hoping your opponent doesn't have like an instant speed way to target it, or that it's going to like just benefit you that it can't be targeted for the rest of the turn. So I wonder in Magic if this card actually works like how Forbidden Dress is supposed to. People still seldomly played Forbidden Dress, if I recall, but only because I think it also has like it might have a secondary effect too that's like kind of relevant, but also making it immune to targeting for the turn is like fine, but you can't use it reactively. So I wonder in Magic if Silver Shroud costume is actually supposed to work how Forbidden Dress was. I think it was like intended to work that way, but the way like mechanically Yu-Gi-Oh works, like maybe it just didn't pan out. So I'm wondering if this works the way it's like supposed to, which in that case, that would be really cool. Also making it that it can't be blocked it'd be interesting if like Forbidden Dress also said like, oh, the creature can attack directly, right? Having that line of text on it as well. Because that's like honestly the only thing distinguishing the two cards apart. But if it works that way, it's interesting, right? Because it's weird because something's already targeted, but like then you have this thing that makes it like immune to that. Maybe it's a wording thing. I don't fucking know. But Forbidden Dress saw like seldom to no play for the most part. And I'm not sure if this card is like good or if it's just like a nice card depending on the type of deck that you're playing. Like it's probably like deck specific, like a lot of cards are. So if it works as intended, it can be useful, sure. And it's cool that it just like has the ability that it can't be blocked. So depending on the type of deck that you're playing, maybe you can always get in with it. But it's interesting to see like almost a one-to-one comparison of a card like exactly in Yu-Gi-Oh! But I imagine this one works as it's supposed to, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just bad and it doesn't work. Interesting card, interesting card. All right, what do we got next? Traumatize. This one's a bit expensive. Target player puts the top half of his or her library rounded down into his or her graveyard. Oh my god. So this sort of goes back to the mill stuff. So this does cost 5, so you're not doing this immediately. We do have a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Well, so for the most part, Reasoning and Monster Gate can already do this sort of. You obviously have to like get a little bit lucky and decide, where this just literally you take half the deck and put it into the graveyard. The closest comparison to this, people probably already thinking of, is That Grass Looks Greener. So That Grass Looks Greener is a very interesting card because I'm not sure about like the deck sizes in Magic. I imagine for Commander, you always have to play 100, but for like Yu-Gi-Oh, we actually have a deck range. So you can either play 40 cards at the minimum or 60 cards at the maximum. And so when That Grass Looks Greener was printed, it was actually very interesting from like a deck building perspective, because that card reads, you mill cards from the top of your deck until you and your opponent have the same number of cards in deck. So if your opponent's playing 40 cards and you're playing 60, you're both going to draw 5 for turn, right? You just at base value can mill 20 cards from your deck to the graveyard, which, as you can imagine by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, is fucking crazy and probably not okay, right? So that card was banned. I think it's actually legal again, which is insane. There are some decks that can take advantage of it, but that card is very annoying. But it was interesting because it inspired this new deck building philosophy that a lot of people wanted to play 60 cards because they wanted to have access to this extremely powerful card that essentially, if it resolved, they won the game. Because in Yu-Gi-Oh, the graveyard's so powerful, it's effectively your second hand, that you would get so many effects and so much value off of milling those 20 cards. And sometimes it could be more, right? If your opponent goes first and does the, their thing, and they get an extra like 5-6 cards out of their deck throughout the tutoring and all the things that you can do in Yu-Gi-Oh, you might mill more. Like you might mill like 25 or 30, right? So then it gets even more powerful and scales that way. So what ended up happening during the time was a lot of people were trying to play 60 card decks, not because they were necessarily playing grass, but more because they wanted to not have their opponent be able to resolve grass and made that a dead card in their deck. So it's funny because then like in games 2 and 3, you would side out those cards because then you would just, they were dead. They literally just didn't do anything, or they would mill for like 5 or like, 3 or something just like measly and insignificant. So that was a really interesting time in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think people started to really look at deck building in a much different way compared to prior to the release of Grass. And so this card reminds me of that in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's not like an exact one-to-one comparison, but the fact that you just like, oh, take my deck, throw it in the graveyard, cool. Like, you know, that just sounds insane. Again, in Magic, you have to pay for stuff, so you can't see like the immediate value there. But being able to, I imagine you're just milling yourself with this card. I guess there's a world you could mill your opponent if you wanted to, but you're always probably using this on yourself. And yeah, that seems pretty fucking good. Next up, Defense of the Heart. This looks like an old card. This is 4 mana, so it's a little bit on the expensive side. It's an enchantment, so that's like a continuous spell for us. During your upkeep, so during our standby phase, let's say, if one of your opponents controls 3 or more creatures, one of your opponents controls 3 or more creatures. Okay, so not like between all of them if you're playing Commander. So one of them has to control 3. Sacrifice Defense of the Heart, search your library for up to 2 creature cards, and put them into play? That's really interesting. So, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has aged, we've definitely gotten more cards over time that are, like, tailor-made for if you lose the die roll and your opponent's going first, to sort of give you an advantage for going second. Obviously, like, the first example of this is, like, Cyber Dragon for all the boomers, because it was a monster you could special summon for free that had a very large attack stat compared to, like, everything else you could normal summon. But the restriction on that card was that you had to control no monsters, and your opponent had to control a monster minimum. And then they started making, like, way more broken versions of that card, such as Dino Wrestler Pankratops, Fenrir, which not only can, like, you can just special summon Fenrir on your turn, which is even more crazy. But obviously going second, Fenrir is insane, too, because it starts, like, banishing stuff. But there's all these other cards they started printing that require your opponent to be, like, ahead in a way in order for you to take advantage of this powerful effect. Like, Pankratops is insane because it's a huge monster, and if it ever gets threatened, you just tribute it to pop another card. So, like, it can take multiple cards out with it and can just dominate a game. This card straight up just says, like, if your opponent has more monsters, you just get to get any 2 monsters from your deck for free. Now, it's funny because reading this, you would think, like, having 3 or more creatures, or rather your opponent having 3 or more creatures, would be, like, this massive downside. But in Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's so many instances where, like, an opponent takes their first turn, and even if you're slowing them down with particular hand traps, right, they may still end on a board that has 3 or more monsters, even though the maximum we can have in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is 5. Like, that's not uncommon depending on the format that you're playing in. So I'm trying to imagine a world where this is, like, a continuous spell, and then, like, you tribute it, and you're able to just get any 2 monsters out of your deck for free and just special summon them. And that would be, like, that would be really interesting from a gameplay perspective because, one, it would be fucking broken 100% because then you can just get, like, the best 2 monsters in your deck that you haven't even normal summoned yet, right? The fact that this is generic, like, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, a card like this might exist if it was, like, tied to a specific archetype, but the fact that this, and I imagine this is a consequence of it being an older design card, if you could do this for any 2 monsters in your deck, that is just, like, batshit crazy. That is just so not okay. That, like, there are cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That can fetch monsters out of the deck that are kind of generic. It's, like, the card I'm thinking of is, like, there's, like, Emergency Teleport, which lets you get any psychic monster from your deck, but it has to be a particular level, and then it dies during the end of the turn. This card just, like, brings them out, and they just fucking stay there, which is... that's unbelievable to me. And there's, like, no restriction on, like, what you can get either. It's not like, oh, they have to cost a certain amount or anything like that. So I imagine this was, like, intended to be, like, a comeback card. But I'm seeing this as, like, from a gameplay perspective, this is fascinating because when we have these types of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That are kind of tailor-made for going second and have this sort of threshold of, like, if X happens, you can do Y. I'm thinking of Nibiru the Primal Being, for instance. Nibiru says if your opponent normal or special summons 5 times during their turn, 5 or more times, you basically just get to wipe the board and then summon a giant 3,000 attack point monster, and they also get a monster on their field as well. So I'm curious if a card like this were in Yu-Gi-Oh! As crazy as it is, I wonder how much it would influence people playing around it if it was respected, because people engineer combos with the Nibiru example people would engineer combos in such a way that they would be able to stop on 4 summons, or would find a way to put up a monster or a card that could negate Nibiru so that they could continue going past 5 summons. And if they tried to Nibiru, then they could use their monster to negate that effect, and that way they could continue to keep playing. I'm curious if people would engineer combos in a way that if this card was legal and if it was like insanely good, because they'd have to change a few things on it, I think. If people would try to engineer combos that they would only end on 2 monsters instead of 3 or more to play around this card existing. And I honestly think they would, because it's like, why would you want to like lose to this card? Because I feel like if you have 3 monsters and you don't have a way to negate this, which is funny because like Ash Blossom could negate this because it's special summoning stuff from the deck. If your opponent did not have a way to negate this card, I feel like they're probably going to be in a winning position because they can grab literally any 2 monsters in the deck. And from there, the world is their oyster, because that's 2 monsters they could use for a Link summon, an Xyz summon, a Synchro summon. They can just like start using ignition effects on summon effects. Like, I mean, it's kind of like Rescue Cat or like Rescue Rabbit, but like generic, because like those cards could fetch 2 monsters out of the deck, but there was restrictions where like it had to be a certain type, certain level. It was only on your turn. And I think later with the errata with like Rescue Cat, like the effects get negated. But even then, the monsters like would still die during the end of the turn if you didn't do anything with them, where like this card just keeps them on the field. So you could get like the 2 biggest haymakers out of your deck, or the 2 biggest combo starters, and just go the fuck off. And you still haven't even committed to a normal summon yet, so you still have the ability to... This is... Wow. Like, this... I actually think like a card like this in Yu-Gi-Oh!, if it was like more tailor-made for the game, might actually be really interesting, as a matter of fact. I don't know if interesting like in a way that people would like it, but I always am in favor of like when there are more tools for going second that are like interesting. But this one might be like too good. Going first, though, this card's awful, because your opponent isn't going to have monsters on the field most likely when you go first. So you never want to have this card in going first. So you'd most likely have this as like a side deck card, and there's plenty of cards people side deck that they use to like get back into the game. So the fact that this is a card that you could bring in that is a way to try to break the opponent's board, because it's, instead of it being something that like prevents your opponent from playing like a Dark Ruler No More, a Lightning Storm, like Ultimate Slayer, like all these other like just evenly matched, like these like go second cards, this card just gives you access to Engine, and gives you access to Engine in like one of the most powerful ways imaginable, because it's a double E-Telly that doesn't kill in the end phase. Very interesting card, as a matter of fact. Extremely interesting card. I'm curious to hear what you guys have to think about this one. I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while. I think we only have a few more here. Let's see what we got. Mystic Remora. This is a cheap one. It's an enchantment. Seems like we have several enchantments here. This has cumulative upkeep 1, which I don't know how this would work for us because we don't pay things. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent, then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. Interesting. So, mana's the resource system in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I want to say cards are the resource system, or I'm sorry, mana's the resource system in Magic. I want to say cards are the resource system in Yu-Gi-Oh! So, like, maybe a trade-off here. Let me read the rest of the card first. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. So you're telling me Magic has max C? I'm sorry. Magic has permanent max C for anything that is not a creature. Excuse me? Okay, let me go back here. So obviously there's like a cost to this, because you need to like pay to keep this card in play. It's interesting because what I was going to say was the equivalent for Yu-Gi-Oh! For like paying for this card might be like discarding cards. So like maybe you play this, and then during, let's say a full turn cycle happens, you need to pay the upkeep for this. Maybe you have to discard a card if you want to keep this effect in play. And then next turn, since it's cumulative, you have to discard 2 cards to keep this card in play. Not that the game is going to probably last that long, to be honest, but this is maybe one of the most broken Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards I could imagine, because it is max C for spell cards, essentially, or traps. It is max C for spell and trap cards. Max C is arguably one of the most divisive and most hated cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it creates so many non-games by putting people in a situation that is unwinnable 9 times out of 10. And this is just that for things that aren't creatures. Now, to be fair, creatures and special summoning is like the main gimmick of Yu-Gi-Oh! So there is a world where there's like creature-heavy decks where this card could do nothing, but there's still a high density of spell cards in these decks because there are cards that just say, like, add a monster from deck to hand, special summon a monster from your hand to the field or from your deck to the field. Spell cards that try to, like, stop the opponent from doing things after, like, their first turn, kind of like what I mentioned before, like with the Defense of the Heart card. There's no shortage of spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially at, like, a competitive level. Trap cards, less so, unless you're playing, like, specifically a trap-focused deck. But even then, I can't imagine how fucking miserable it must be to try to do anything that is, like, non-creature playing against this. Like, I can't imagine, like, my opponent's like, okay, cool, I'm gonna do my thing, and then I'm gonna slap down Mystic Remora. So now, anytime you activate a spell card, I get to draw a card on top of that, which then will allow them to draw into hand traps, which are more forms of interruption. Technically, again, if this card were to exist, that might actually reduce the amount of spell cards that people want to try to play, because if, like, everyone's playing this card because it's fucking broken, then maybe people are going to find a way to just not play spells. And we've seen that before with, like, Sekka's Light and stuff. When Sekka's was at 3, people were happy to play 37 card monster decks because you got to play 3 Pot of Greed, essentially, because that was, like, the deck building restriction of that card. So it's not like we haven't seen, like, Monster Mash decks before, but God, how the fuck is this legal? This has got to be miserable. And especially if you're playing, like, Commander, you're playing against 3 other people, and you're telling me that there's, like, any time anyone does anything that's not a creature, you get to draw, and you have to pay for... Who fucking cares that you have to pay for it? You get to draw a million fucking cards off of this. How is this okay? Like, I literally cannot imagine a world where Konami is like, okay, we're going to print Max C for spell cards. I think the community would fucking riot if that were to happen. Because, like... Max C, by, like, Master Duel and, like, the OCG standards, and, like, the Mulcharmies are already bad enough, but then they're... Oh, my God. Imagine they print, like, Mulcharmy Remora fucker that's like, oh, it's the same as all the other Mulcharmies, but this one's for spell cards. Oh, my... I think people would fucking riot in the streets. That would be, like, unthinkable if they printed something like that. What the fuck, dude? Like, what the actual fuck? I don't know what to say. I genuinely don't know what to say to this one. This might be the most broken thing that I've seen out of all of them. Literally Max C for spell cards. I can't even imagine how fucking insane that would be. Unbelievable. Here we have a big fucker. This is Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre. This is a guy that is very big and says... It's funny because, like, in Yu-Gi-Oh! We'd probably play this on the first turn. It says, when you cast it, destroy target permanent. That might be good, and I don't know how good that is, to be honest. Like, obviously, I know it's good. Destroying things is good, but I don't know how good that is in the context of you're paying 11 mana to play this just to, like, destroy something. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, that's not hard at all, so, like, cool. It pops something. It's indestructible, which by Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards means it can't be destroyed, I want to say. I think it can still be targeted, because that would be with the other card. I think it was, like, Shroud or something. So you can still target this and do things to it, but it can't be just, like, board wiped or single targeted removal. But, okay, you're playing a big guy. It's good to have, like, a little protection, I guess. And then it has Annihilator 4, which says, whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. Do we have a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That when it attacks, it makes the close... I know, like, Fenrir, when Fenrir attacks, you get to banish a monster they control face down, but it's one monster specifically. So I'm kind of imagining this card is like... This is like if they put evenly matched on a monster. Because evenly matched says you activate it and your opponent banishes cards face down to the difference between, like, the cards that you each control. So, like, if your opponent has 5 and the only card you have is evenly matched, that means you'd have 1. So they have to banish 4 cards they control face down. But they get to choose. But this is, like, the same effect, but it's on a creature, and they can use it every single turn as long as they're swinging. I'm trying to think if there's anything close to that. Like Fenrir's the thing, but Fenrir doesn't make the opponent choose. You get to pick with Fenrir, which is way better, but it's only one card. The fact they you get to get rid of 4 things they control is like kind of crazy. I think there's some things in Yu-Gi-Oh that it's interesting though too, because if it's the opponent chooses, that plays around certain protection effects because they're the ones sending those cards to the graveyard. And that's come up quite a few times in Yu-Gi-Oh where you use these types of effects to sort of bypass protection. So that's pretty good, but slapping evenly matched on a monster, although like this is different than evenly matched, but just because they get to choose what they're getting rid of. That seems pretty damn good to me, but like, is it worth it for like how like large this thing is? Maybe you just like cheat this thing out. Like maybe the idea here is like you just like mill this either selectively or just when you do your big, you know, pile with like Hermit Druid or that other mill card. And then maybe you just like cheat it back out into place. You just bypass the fact that it costs 11. That's very Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like that would be a Yu-Gi-Oh! Thing to do. Because then you have this big fucker on the field that's just going to be making your opponent get rid of all their stuff every single turn if they can't answer it, especially since it's indestructible. It also says when it's put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles it into their library. So I guess that's like a downside, right? So then I think the theory there is you can't like infinitely like recur it from the graveyard. Because like if your opponent like does find a way to get rid of it, like maybe it's like a targeting effect that like in Yu-Gi-Oh! We have stuff that sends to the graveyard, doesn't destroy. So that would play around this indestructible effect here. So maybe that line of text is there so that you can't just like infinitely like recur it from the graveyard to the field. That would be like my guess. But then like there's so many cards in this game that you can just get half your deck into the graveyard or get like things like this back into the graveyard. So I guess it's extra work, but this card's a menace though. I'm wondering if something like this would be even like good in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the sense that I guess if it was like easy enough to summon, like making them have to sack their board, that could be decent. I think it's just contextual to like whatever the format is and like what decks are good. Because having to wait to go to combat to use an effect like this is like the biggest downside. I think Magic's a lot more like combat focused in a lot of ways, where Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! The battle phase is sort of just like a mechanism more often than not to like end the game. And there's obviously like there is combat and it matters like sort of. But for the most part, like +1s in combat are like not nearly as ubiquitous as like they used to be. Because so many things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just have an effect to like pop something or bounce something or like do whatever. I guess it depends how like easy it would be. Like in Yu-Gi-Oh! You just go, okay, like dump it to the grave with Foolish Burial, reborn it back. Everything in our game doesn't have summoning sickness, so everything is haste. So then you could immediately just swing with this. And if your opponent has like 4 things and no way to answer that, everything gets just sacked off and you just like win the game. I mean, that seems pretty good. Like as long as that's just easy enough to do. It's interesting. I mean, Fenrir is like insane for multiple reasons, and being able to like just solo going second is one of them. But this card does require setup, and maybe this is just like the big payoff for whatever deck that you're playing. Neat card. Neat card. And last but not least, I thought this would be the funniest one to save for last, because how in the holy mother of fuck is this card legal? I'm sorry. This would be banned immediately if this would be banned before it was even printed in Yu-Gi-Oh! So this card, if you've never seen it, is Treasure Cruise. This card is a sorcery, so it's a normal spell by Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards. It has the effect Delve. Delve says each card you exile from your graveyard while casting the spell pays for 1. So hypothetically, this card costs 8. You can banish 7 cards from your graveyard to activate this card, draw 3 cards. Now, I already know what a lot of you are thinking. The closest analog to this, that I can think of anyway, is, oh my god, what is the card name? It's going to drive me nuts. It's the thing from Phantom Darkness. Anyway, I forget the name. I don't know why for the life of me, I can't remember the name. But anyway, that card says if you have 7 or more dark monsters in your graveyard, you banish 5 of them to draw 3 cards. That card, I remember people being so hyped for because it says draw 3 cards on a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, and dark monsters are notoriously like some of the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just like on average, if you were to rank the 6 attributes in Yu-Gi-Oh! 7 for the people that count divine, dark would probably be like the S tier for like 9 times out of 10, because dark support is just, for whatever reason, unbelievably just nuts compared to the other 5 for the most part. Anyway, that card got a ton of hype. But it actually turned out that even like by modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards, getting 7 dark monsters into the graveyard is sort of challenging But also, a lot of the times you kind of want the monsters in the graveyard for like one reason or another. Like maybe you're going to recur them to the field. Maybe they have like other effects in the graveyard that you want to use, that it's like, oh, banish this to like special something from your deck, right? Or like banish these cards to like special something from the extra deck. So there's a lot of like interesting like sorcery speed graveyard effects that a card like the Beginning of the End, that's the name of it. I don't know why I could not think of the name of the card. It made Beginning of the End a card that actually didn't see a ton of play. There was a deck that was an FTK deck that played so many dark monsters and went through the deck so quickly that Beginning of the End actually was played at 3 copies because it allowed the deck to keep going, and you were trying to dump your whole deck anyway for the FTK that you were trying to achieve. I think that's maybe the most playable that card ever was, because historically when it was printed way back in the day, I think there just wasn't enough ways to really fuel the graveyard to take advantage of a card like that. This card, on the other hand, is fucking crazy because this doesn't matter what you banish. You can banish fucking anything, right? And so you can be like, okay, I'm going to activate spell, or I'm going to go like spell, get monster, play another monster, link those 2 off, like get a guy, get another guy, like do something with those 2, get another guy, play a spell, that does a thing, do something. You're already at 7 cards, right? And maybe you only use like 2 from your hand. And now you're like, oh, cool, do this, exile my whole graveyard of 7 cards, because I don't give a shit about banishing spell cards, because there's usually no way to get those back anyway. Banish my whole graveyard and just draw 3 fucking cards. Like, how the fuck is that legal? Like, I'm sorry. Like, especially seeing some of the other shit that I've seen in this video with like the Hermit Druid, with that other spell that you just take half your fucking deck and just throw it into the graveyard. Oh, cool. Now you can just Treasure Cruise, get rid of everything, draw 3, and guess what? Treasure Cruise again, because there's no like once per fucking turn on this card. Banish 7 more, draw, like... This reminds me of Fairy Tale Snow, which was a card that said banish 7 cards from like anywhere. So it was like graveyard, field, hand. And it was a thing that could special summon itself out to the field. And then it had a bunch of other like utility and stuff like that. It was very good, very broken. Might still be banned actually, because that card is not okay. If it is legal, that's unfortunate. But anyway, it's been so long, I don't remember. I think it was like banned then unbanned. Maybe it's rebanned. I don't fucking know. Anyway, point being is that card was like insane, and that didn't even draw you cards. So that was like different for like other reasons, but it was not difficult for these decks, especially when like grass was legal. I guess it's like technically still legal, but you know what I mean? Like when grass is legal, with the ways that you are able to just fill your graveyard with all these resources and materials, because you have to play spell cards to typically get to your main cards. You're going to be using the monsters for synchro summons, Xyz summons. I guess Xyz is probably not as bad because they don't go to the graveyard, but whatever, you know what I mean? You need to get like link monsters on the field or whatever. So you're always like constantly putting minimum 2 monsters into your graveyard to get another monster on the field. And back in the day, there was like Pot of Avarice, which was banned for a long period of time because it was easy enough to fill the graveyard with 5 monsters that you could shuffle back into the deck to draw 2. The fact that there is like Pot of Avarice that you can banish spells and it draws 3 instead of 2 is unbelievable to me. Now, again, there could be like rare instances where this card is bad, right? Because I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to open a hand of 4 hand traps and Treasure Cruise, right? In that instance, this card sucks because now you have like no way to actually use this. But like, if you just see your engine in like any capacity, as long as you can, first of all, the 4 hand traps are going to slow the opponent down ideally, right? So that's already 1 or 2 cards that are getting to the, I didn't even get into hand traps, holy shit. So you get 1 or 2 cards in the graveyard just from that. And then if you draw like a singular engine piece that's able to like start getting your combo going and fuel the graveyard, oh no, my combo got stopped. Anyway, Treasure Cruise, draw 3 more, I can keep fucking going. I think the only other card, there might be a couple others, but the one that comes to mind, for context, for all you Magic players watching this, the only other card that comes to mind that draws 3 cards is called Card of Demise. Wait till you hear the number of restrictions on this card. Card of Demise is you can only draw up to until you're holding 3 cards. So you need to have no hand for it if you want to draw 3. That's one restriction. The second restriction is, I'm pretty sure you can't special summon the turn you activate Card of Demise. And for the rest of the turn after you activate Card of Demise, your opponent takes no damage. So you could go to battle, attack, and then Card of Demise. but if you use it in your first main phase, your opponent's not going to take any damage for that turn. And then finally, Card of Demise also has a once per turn restriction on it as well. And I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong, Card of Demise might be like limited at this very moment, because even by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, all those restrictions, that card is still really fucking good in the right decks. Now, don't get me wrong, it has to be the right decks, but that's insane to me. This is a common. This is also a fucking common card. So this card probably costs like 2 cents. This would be like super secret short print mega rare in Yu-Gi-Oh! And would cost like $4 billion if they printed this. And that would be intentional, by the way. I can't believe this is a common. This card is unbelievable. How is looking at all this, Magic's insane. Magic's insane. So that's it. Not really. I think I'm like broken after that. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching me just like lose my mind looking at some of these Magic cards and that I may or may not be playing in the future. Hopefully we get to use some of these in that case, because I want to see how broken these cards actually are, or if they're like actually just totally fine. And from my underdeveloped Yu-Gi-Oh brain that maybe they're okay. Maybe they're fine. I guess we'll have to see. So thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing your comments and responses as to like, other weird, cool applications that some of these cards might have. But it's cool to look at other card games and see just how crazy some of their cards are. And like Max C for spell cards. That is the one I cannot get over. That honestly, that might be worse than the Treasure Cruise, to be honest. That would just be no. So thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for another video. I really hope you all enjoyed. Let's go ahead and shout the patrons for all their continued support. So shouts to Shout1317, Tim00x3, MBT Play Medolce, Moto, Cameron L. Smith, The Synchro Guy, Pony Stark, Dan the Man Hoban, Little Fadeleaf, Draconic, Brian Dancer of Class 7, Dylan Rare Hunter, JW11860, Flannel Daddy, literally all of the guinea pigs, Cheeks McLapperty, Stolfin Amethyst, MBT canceled by community soon, canceled by all committees soon, canceled by all players soon, Wonder Waffle, MBT and Nimnims 1, Boxer Brief, Fueled Knight of Passion, Daniel Howell, Electrician of the Ice Barrier, Arco, and the Nova 129. Thank you again so much for watching, and we will see you next time.